deep beneath the eternal city of Rome, where the cobblestone streets hum with the echoes of centuries, lies a place few have ever seen. Picture it, a labyrinth of shadowed corridors, where the air is thick with the scent of aged parchment and wax seals. The Vatican Secret Archives, a vault of human history, stretched silently beneath the grandeur of St. Peter's Basilica. Shelves tower like ancient sentinels, cradling scrolls, letters, and tomes that whisper secrets of popes, kings, and forgotten souls. The dim light flickers, casting long shadows across manuscripts that have not felt the touch of human hands in generations. This is not a place of conspiracy or wild tales spun in the dark corners of the internet. No, this is a sanctuary of truth. Truths so delicate, so profound, that they've been guarded for centuries, entrusted to only a chosen few. My name is Father Elias, or at least that's what they call me when I walk these halls. For years, I was a priest, a man of faith who believed in the Church's mission to guide and protect. But my role was not just to preach from a pulpit or to offer absolution in a confessional. I was a custodian, one of the rare souls granted access to the Vatican Secret Archives. My hands turned the brittle pages of documents that told stories the world was not meant to hear. Not yet, perhaps not ever. I walked among letters penned by emperors, confessions scrawled by trembling hands, and decrees that shaped the course of nations. Each document was a thread in the tapestry of humanity, woven with faith, power, and sacrifice. And yet, as I read, I began to see the weight of what was hidden, not out of malice, but out of a desire to protect, to preserve, to control. What is it about secrets that draws us in? Perhaps it's the promise of knowing something others don't, of glimpsing the truth behind the veil. The Vatican Secret Archives are not a myth or a plot device from a novel. They are real, vast, and meticulously guarded. Spanning 85 kilometers of shelves, they hold over 35,000 cataloged entries, letters, papal bulls, trial records, and artifacts that trace the Church's footsteps through time. But these are not secrets in the way we think of them today, shrouded in scandal or deceit. The word secret here means private, sacred, set apart. These are the private records of an institution that has stood for 2 millennia, navigating the storms of empires, wars, and revolutions. To step into the archives is to step into the heart of the Church itself, a heart that beats with both divine aspiration and human imperfection. My journey began in a small village in Tuscany, where the church bells rang each morning and the olive grove swayed under the Mediterranean sun. I was a boy who dreamed of serving God, of being a light in a world that often felt dark. That dream led me to the priesthood, and eventually to Rome. I remember the first time I descended into the archives, the heavy iron gate creaking as it opened, the air cool and heavy with the weight of history. I was young, eager, and perhaps a little naive. I thought I was there to catalog and preserve, to organize the past for the future. But the more I read, the more I realized that these documents were not just records. They were confessions, questions, and cries from the soul of the Church. They told of triumphs and failures, of moments when faith shone brightly and others when it faltered under the pressures of power and politics. Why am I telling you this? Because the truth is not something to be feared. It is not a weapon to wield or a trophy to display. It is a light, faint at times, but enduring. These archives are not about conspiracies or hidden treasure maps. They are about the human struggle to understand God, to navigate a world of beauty and brokenness. They are about the choices made in quiet rooms, the letters written in candlelight, the decisions that shaped history while the world looked the other way. As a priest, I swore to serve the truth. As a former priest, I feel compelled to share it, not to tear down, but to build up, to help you see the Church not as a monolith, but as a living, breathing entity, flawed and yet striving. Imagine standing in the archives, the silence, so deep it feels like a presence. You reach for a manuscript, its leather cover cracked with age. The words inside tell of a pope wrestling with a decision that could save or doom thousands, of a scholar begging for mercy, of a woman whose visions of God were deemed too dangerous to share. These are not just stories. They are the pulse of history, the heartbeat of an institution that has shaped our world for better or worse. As I walked those halls, I began to question not my faith, but the silences we choose to keep. Why do some truths remain buried? Who decides what is too sacred, too dangerous to be shared? And what does it mean to guard a secret not out of fear, but out of love? This is not a tale of betrayal or expose. It is a journey into the heart of an institution that has stood at the crossroads of faith and power for centuries. It is about the documents I held, the words I read, and the truths I carried with me when I left the priesthood. My story is not one of anger, but of awe at the complexity of the Church, at the weight of its history, and at the resilience of the human spirit. These archives are a mirror, reflecting not just a church, but all of us, our hopes, our mistakes, our longing for something greater. As we begin this journey together, I invite you to listen with an open heart. The Vatican Secret Archives are not a place of darkness, but of memory that deserves to be heard. Over the coming chapters, we'll walk through these halls together, uncovering stories of faith, power, and sacrifice. We'll explore the trials of great minds, the silences that shaped history, and the voices that refuse to be forgotten. This is not about tearing down walls, but about opening doors. So, come with me, dear listener, into the shadows of the Vatican, where the past whispers and the truth waits patiently to be found. Subscribe to the Sacred Chronicle, and I'll ask God to bring all the good things into your life. Let's step into the archives together, where every page holds a story, and every story holds a truth. My life changed in those halls, and perhaps, as we uncover these hidden memories, yours might too. Imagine descending a spiral staircase, each step echoing softly against the stone walls, leading you deeper into the earth beneath the Vatican. The air grows cooler, carrying the faint aroma of old leather and ink, a scent that speaks of time itself preserved in stillness. As the door to the archive swings open, you're enveloped in a world where history breathes, rows upon rows of shelves stretching into dim light, like the veins of a great ancient heart. This is the Vatican Secret Archives, a place not of intrigue or shadowy plots, but of quiet guardianship over the Church's most private memories. The word secret here doesn't conjure images of hidden agendas or forbidden knowledge locked away to manipulate the masses. No, in its Latin root, secretum simply means set apart, private, reserved for those who understand the weight of what lies within. It's a library of the soul, where documents are not concealed out of fear, but protected like cherished family letters, meant to be handled with reverence and care. As a custodian, I spent countless hours in these halls, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpets laid to preserve the silence. The archives span an astonishing 85 kilometers of shelving. Imagine that, a distance longer than the drive from Rome to Naples, all filled with the written word. Over 35,000 cataloged entries form the backbone of this collection, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are papal bulls from the Middle Ages, handwritten letters from saints and sinners alike, maps drawn by explorers who carried the cross into unknown lands, and record of councils that debated the very nature of God. Each shelf holds volumes bound in vellum, their spines etched with gold leaf that catches the light from the carefully placed lamps. The temperature is controlled to a precise degree, humidity monitored like a vital sign, ensuring that these fragile pages endure for generations yet unborn. It's not a museum for the curious. It's a vault for the faithful, a repository where the Church's history is chronicled in meticulous detail, from the grandeur of coronations to the quiet confessions of doubt. Access to this treasure trove is as guarded as the secrets it holds. Only a select few, perhaps 60 to 80 scholars each year, are permitted entry, and even then under strict conditions. You don't simply walk in, you apply, providing credentials that prove your scholarly intent, your respect for material. Once approved, you're escorted, your every move observed. No photographs, no unsupervised browsing. Requests for specific documents must be precise, and even then, not everything is available. Some sections remain closed, not because they hide scandals, but because they contain personal correspondences, diplomatic exchanges that could still ripple through modern politics if mishandled. I remember reviewing applications in my early days. Historians seeking insights into medieval theology, archaeologists piecing together the puzzle of early Christianity. Each visitor was like a pilgrim, approaching with humility, leaving with fragments of truth that enriched their work without compromising the archive's sanctity. The archive's origins trace back to the early days of the Church, when popes began collecting documents to preserve the faith's continuity. In the 17th century, Pope Paul V formalized this into the secret archives, separating them from a Vatican library to ensure privacy. Over time, they've grown, absorbing collections from dissolved monasteries, conquered territories, and even the spoils of war. Think of the Napoleonic era, when French troops carted off entire sections of Paris, only for them to be returned years later, battered but intact. Or the World Wars, when the archives were sealed and protected, their contents a silent witness to the chaos above. As I dusted the shelves, I often paused to read a fragment, a note from a long-dead cardinal, pondering the stars or lamenting a lost battle. These weren't just papers. They were voices, echoing across time, reminding me that the Church is not an abstract entity, but a community of people, each with their own stories of devotion and struggle. What makes the archives truly mysterious is not what they hide, but what they reveal about the human condition. In one corner, you might find illuminated manuscripts from the Renaissance, their colors still vibrant, depicting scenes of biblical wonder. In another, stacks of diplomatic cables from the 20th century, detailing negotiations that averted crises or sometimes failed to. The scope is breathtaking. From the decrees of the Council of Trent, which reformed the Church in the face of Protestantism, to the personal diaries of missionaries who braved distant shores. I recall handling a fragile scroll from the 13th century, its wax seal intact, bearing the imprint of a papal ring. It spoke of indulgences granted, sins forgiven, lives altered by a single stroke of the pen. These documents aren't locked away to deceive. They're preserved to teach, to remind future guardians of the lessons learned in the crucible of history. Yet, the mystery deepens when you consider the sheer volume. 85 kilometers. That's enough shelving to line the banks of the Tiber River multiple times over. And the 35,000 entries? They represent only the catalog core. Untold numbers of items await full indexing, their contents known only to a handful. Scholars admitted must navigate this with patience, often waiting weeks for materials to be retrieved from the depths. The rules are ironclad. No originals leave the reading room. Copies are made under supervision, and certain collections, like those pertaining to ongoing canonizations or recent papal administrations, remain off-limits until decades have passed. This isn't secrecy for secrecy's sake. It's a deliberate pace, allowing time for reflection, for the dust of controversy to settle before the full light of inquiry shines upon it. In my time there, I witnessed the archive's quiet power. One scholar, a quiet professor from Germany, spent months poring over letters from the Enlightenment era, uncovering how the Church engaged with emerging sciences. Another, a nun from Africa, sought records of early missions to her homeland, finding threads that connected her faith to ancestors long gone. These visitors weren't spies or sensationalists. They were seekers, much like I was. But as custodian, I saw the other side, the burden of protection. Documents that could be misinterpreted, twisted into weapons against the Church, were handled with extra care, not hidden but contextualized, ensuring that when they emerge, they do so with the full story intact. The Vatican Secret Archives are a testament to the Church's enduring presence in the world. They hold not just facts, but the essence of faith tested by time. As we wander these imaginary halls together, remember that every document is a bridge between past and present, a whisper from those who came before. The mystery isn't in the shadows, but in the light they cast on our shared humanity. The Vatican Secret Archives unfold like a tapestry, each thread a story of triumph, tragedy, or quiet resilience. As I walk those silent corridors, the weight of history pressed against me. Not just the Church's history, but the world's. Church's history, but the world's. The documents I held weren't mere records. They were portals to moments that shaped civilizations, moments where faith met the raw edge of human ambition. Picture a dimly lit reading room, a single lamp casting a golden glow over a table strewn with manuscripts. The parchment crinkles under careful fingers, revealing words that once shook the foundations of empires. These are the stories of Galileo Galilei, the Knights Templar, the Church's dance with Nazi Germany, and letters from voices as diverse as Michelangelo and indigenous leaders. Each case, preserved in ink and vellum, tells us something about the Church's role as both a spiritual guide and a player in the theater of history. Let's begin with Galileo, a name that echoes through time like a comet streaking across the sky. In 1633, he stood before the Inquisition, his eyes weary but defiant, accused of heresy for daring to claim the earth orbited the sun. The archives hold the records of his trial, pages upon pages of arguments, scribbled in Latin, detailing the clash between science and scripture. I remember turning those pages, feeling the tension in the precise handwriting of the inquisitors. Galileo's own letters, preserved among the stacks, reveal a man torn between his love for truth and his respect for the church. He wasn't a rebel seeking to destroy faith. He was a devout Catholic who saw the stars as God's handiwork. Yet, the church, fearful of a world unmoored from its teachings, sentenced him to house arrest. Those documents are not just a condemnation. They're a confession of a church grappling with a universe larger than it could comprehend. The air in the archives seemed to hum as I read, as if Galileo's own voice lingered, whispering of a truth that could not be silenced. Centuries earlier, another drama unfolded: the fall of the Knights Templar. In the early 14th century, these warrior monks, once the church's sword and shield, faced accusations of heresy and corruption. The archives contain the chilling records of their trial, ordered by Pope Clement V under pressure from King Philip IV of France. I held a parchment, its edges frayed, detailing confessions extracted under torture, confessions of idolatry and betrayal that many later recanted. The Chinon parchment, rediscovered in the archives in 2001, absolved the Templars of heresy, revealing a pope who doubted the charges but lacked the power to defy a king. The ink was faded, but the weight of those words was heavy. The Templar story is one of loyalty rewarded with betrayal, their legacy reduced to whispers in the margins of history. As I trace their seals, I imagine their final days, their prayers echoing in cold cells, a reminder how power can twist even the holiest of causes. Then there's the shadow of the 20th century, where the archives hold documents that still spark heated debate. The Vatican's relationship with Nazi Germany. The papers from Pius XII's papacy are meticulous, written in the clipped, formal tone of diplomats. They detail secret negotiations, letters to bishops, and reports from priests in occupied territories. I recall a dossier, its pages yellowed, describing the Vatican's efforts to save Jewish lives through quiet diplomacy, safe houses arranged, visas forged in secret. Yet, the same files reveal a silence that haunts. No public condemnation of the Holocaust, no ringing denunciation of Hitler's regime. The documents don't lie. They show a pope navigating a tightrope, fearing that open defiance would bring retribution on Catholics across Europe. As I read, I felt the moral weight of those choices, the delicate balance between survival and principle. The archives don't judge. They simply preserve, leaving us to wrestle with the questions they raise. Beyond these grand narratives, the archives hold smaller, no less poignant voices. A letter from Michelangelo, his handwriting sharp and impatient, pleads for funds to complete the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Another, from Mary, Queen of Scots, written in her final days, speaks of faith amidst despair, her words a fragile thread connecting her to eternity. I found missives from indigenous leaders in the Americas, penned in the 16th century, requesting the Church's protection against colonial brutality. Their voices, written in Spanish or translated by missionaries, are a testament to resilience, their pleas often unanswered or misunderstood. These letters, tucked among thousands, are not grand decrees but human cries, etched in ink that has outlasted empires. Handling them, I felt the distance of centuries collapse, as if those writers stood beside me, their hopes and fears as vivid as my own. Each case in the archives is a window into a world where faith and power collided. The Galileo trial reveals a church struggling to reconcile revelation with reason. The Templars' fall exposes the fragility of loyalty in the face of greed. The wartime documents ask us to consider the cost of silence, even when born of caution. And the letters, from artists, queens, and forgotten peoples, remind us that history is not just a domain of the powerful, but of anyone who dare to leave a mark. As a custodian, I was not just a keeper of papers. I was a witness to these moments, entrusted with their care. The archives taught me that truth is not a single note but a chorus, harmonizing the sacred and the flawed. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly as I worked, each volume a story waiting to be told. I'd pause sometimes, my fingers lingering on a wax seal or a faded signature, imagining the hands that wrote it, the lives it touched. These cases, Galileo's defiance, the Templars' ruin, the Vatican's wartime tightrope, the voices of the marginalized, are not relics of a distant past. They're mirrors, reflecting our own struggles to balance truth, power, and faith. The Vatican Secret Archives don't hide these stories. They preserve them, waiting for the right moment, the right heart, to hear them. The Vatican Secret Archives are not just a collection of words on parchment. They are a repository of choices, some bold, some whispered, and some left unspoken. In the stillness of those underground halls, where the air feels heavy with the weight of centuries, I often found myself pausing, a document in hand, struck by what was not said. The silences of the Vatican are as telling as its proclamations, and nowhere is this more evident than in the pages that touch on the darkest moments of the 20th century. Picture a desk littered with reports, their edges curling, written in the careful script of priests and diplomats. These papers speak of the Holocaust, of knowledge held in private, of actions taken in shadows rather than in the light of public condemnation. As Father Elias, I walked among these silences, and they taught me that sometimes the absence of a voice can echo louder than any sermon. The Holocaust looms large in the archives, not as a single document, but as a mosaic of fragments, letters from bishops in occupied Poland, memos from Vatican envoys, reports smuggled out of ghettos. I remember one such document. Its ink faded but legible, penned by a priest in Warsaw in 1942. His words were urgent, describing the deportation of Jews to camps, the cries of families torn apart. He begged for papal intervention, for a public stand that might rally the world. Yet, the response, preserved in a later file, was measured, diplomatic, urging caution to protect Catholic lives under Nazi rule. Pope Pius XII, whose papacy spanned those brutal years, chose a path of discreet action, quietly arranging safe havens, funneling aid through intermediaries, securing visas for thousands. The archives hold records of these efforts, lists of names saved, convents open as sanctuaries, funds transferred in secret. I traced those lists, imagining the faces behind the names, the lives preserved by a church working behind the scenes. But the silence, the absence of a ringing condemnation of the Nazi regime, hangs heavy. The archives reveal Pius XI's dilemma, a pope caught between moral outrage and the fear that speaking out would provoke Hitler's wrath, endangering millions of Catholics in occupied territories. A 1943 memo, written in tight, hurried script, detailed reports of reprisals against priests who spoke too boldly. Another document, from a Vatican diplomat in Berlin, warned that public defiance could lead to the destruction of Catholic institutions across Europe. I sat with these papers, the lamp above me casting long shadows, and felt the weight of that choice. Was silence complicity, or was it a calculated act of preservation? The archives don't answer. They simply lay bare the facts, dates, names, decisions made in rooms far from the public eye. As I read, I could almost hear the ticking of a clock, the urgency of a world in flames, and the Church's careful steps to navigate it. This strategy of silence was not unique to the Holocaust. The archives reveal a pattern, a deliberate choice to act discreetly rather than proclaim loudly. During the Spanish Civil War, documents show the Vatican quietly negotiating to protect clergy from Franco's forces, while avoiding statements that might inflame the conflict. In Latin America, during the brutal regimes of the 1970s, letters between Vatican officials and local bishops urged moderation, counseling priests to avoid political entanglements even as disappearances mounted. I held a report from Argentina, its pages stained with age, describing a priest's plea for the Vatican to denounce the junta's atrocities. The response, written in precise Latin, advised prayer and prudence. These silences were not indifference, but belief that the Church's survival depended on its ability to endure, to outlast tyrants through quiet resilience. Yet, these choices raise a moral dilemma that lingers like dust in the archive's air. By protecting itself, did the Church risk complicity in the face of evil? The documents offer no easy answers. A letter from a French bishop in 1944, written as the war neared its end, wrestled with this very question. He described his own silence, his fear of speaking out, and his guilt at surviving while others perished. Reading his words, I felt a pang of recognition, not as a priest, but as a man who had also wrestled with the cost of silence. The archives are not a courtroom. They don't judge or absolve. They simply hold these voices, letting them speak across time, asking us to weigh the cost of caution against the call of courage. The silences extend beyond geopolitics. There are personal stories, too, buried in the stacks. Letters from priests who question their faith, confessions of doubt that were never meant to see daylight. I found one such letter, written by a young cleric in the 1930s, his handwriting trembling as he described his horror at hearing of atrocities in Europe. He asked why God allowed such suffering, why the Church did not act as Christ would. The response from a superior was gentle but firm, trust in God's plan, focus on the eternal. That letter, tucked away in a forgotten file, was a silent cry, one of many that the archives preserve. As I read, I imagined that priest, alone in his cell, his faith tested not by theology but by the raw reality of human pain. These silences are not voids. They are spaces filled with intention, fear, and hope. The Vatican's choice to act quietly saved lives. Documents list thousands of Jews hidden in monasteries, children smuggled to safety. But the absence of a public stand left wounds, questions that linger in the hearts of those who look to the Church for moral clarity. As I worked in the archives, I began to see these silences as a mirror, reflecting the Church's humanity, its capacity for both wisdom and error. The documents don't hide the truth. They lay it bare, asking us to listen not just to what was said, but to what was left unsaid. Walking those halls, I felt the weight of those choices, the echoes of voices that never reached the world. Bible, its ability to navigate storms by choosing when to speak and when to stay silent. But they also challenge us to ask, at what cost? The answers lie not in judgment, but in understanding the frail, fierce humanity behind each decision. In the Vatican Secret Archives, the air feels charged, as if the documents themselves hum with the energy of decisions that shaped empires and souls alike. As I moved through those endless shelves, my hands brushing against leather-bound volumes, I sensed the Church not as a distant institution, but as a living force, woven into the fabric of history's great struggles. The archives are a chronicle of faith, yes, but also of power. Power wielded not with swords, but with words, alliances, and the delicate dance of diplomacy. From the age of exploration to the Cold War's shadowed chessboard, the Vatican has stood at the crossroads of belief and politics, its influence stretching far beyond the walls of Rome. These documents, letters, treaties, secret missives, reveal a Church navigating a world where faith could crown kings or topple them, where a single papal decree could redraw maps or spark revolutions. Picture the 16th century, when the world was vast and uncharted, and the Vatican's voice carried the weight of divine authority. The archives hold papal bulls like Intercitera, issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. I held a copy of that document, its Latin text precise, its wax seal cracked but intact. The words, written in a flowing script, granted empires the right to conquer in the name of Christ, blessing colonial expansion with a sacred mandate. The Mediterranean breeze may have carried the scent of spices to Rome, but these pages carry the ambition of nations. They also hold letters from indigenous leaders, their voices pleading for mercy as their lands were claimed, their cultures reshaped. One such letter, from a Taino chief, described his people's suffering, his words translated by a missionary's trembling hand. Reading it, I felt the weight of a Church that saw itself as a beacon of salvation, yet often stood as a pillar of empire, its blessings intertwined with conquest. The archives don't shy away from this duality. They preserve the Church's role in validating empires, from the Spanish conquest to the Portuguese voyages that carved paths across Africa and Asia. A 17th century report, its pages brittle, details the Vatican's negotiations with colonial powers, ensuring missionaries could spread the gospel while monarch Guillermo. The Church's intent was to save souls, but the documents reveal a pragmatic edge. Deals struck to protect Catholic influence in distant lands. As I read, I imagined the missionaries, their robes tattered by jungle heat, carrying both faith and the weight of empire. These records are not accusations. They are reflections of a Church balancing its spiritual mission with the realities of a world ruled by power. Centuries later, the archives reveal another chapter of this dance: the Vatican's relationships with dictatorships in the 20th century. In Latin America, during the turbulent decades of the 1970s and 1980s, the Church walked a perilous line. Documents from Argentina and Chile, written in the terse prose of diplomats, show the Vatican urging restraint of priests caught in crossfire juntas and revolutions. A letter from a Chilean bishop, its ink smudged with urgency, begged for papal support against Pinochet's regime. The response, preserved in a sealed file, advised caution, prioritizing the Church's survival over open defiance. I sat with that letter, the silence of the archives pressing in, and wondered at the cost of such prudence. The Church saved lives through quiet channels, sheltering dissidents, mediating in secret, but its public silence often left it open to accusations of complicity. These documents don't judge. They simply lay bare the choices, the delicate balance of faith and survival. The Cold War brought another layer of complexity. The archives hold secret cables from Vatican envoys in Eastern Europe, their words coded to evade Soviet spies. I read one such cable, written in 1961, detailing a clandestine meeting with Polish resistance leaders. The Vatican, wary of escalating tensions, avoided public confrontation with communist regimes, yet worked tirelessly behind the scenes to protect Catholic communities. A memo from a Vatican diplomat described late-night negotiations in Budapest, the air thick with cigarette smoke, as priests and dissidents planned ways to keep the faith alive under oppression. These documents, their edges worn, reveal a church as a shadow player, never commanding armies, but wielding influence through whispered alliances. As I traced the faded signatures, I felt the tension of those moments, the Church's role as both spiritual guide and political strategist. This interplay of faith and power is not a tale of hypocrisy, but survival in a fractured world. The archives show a church that believed its mission transcended temporal battles, yet could not escape them. A 19th century letter from a cardinal in Vienna, its tone weary, described negotiations with the Austro-Hungarian Empire to preserve Catholic schools. The cardinal's words were laced with frustration, a man of faith caught in the machinery of politics. Reading it, I saw myself in a struggle, not as a priest, but as a man who had once believed faith could stand apart from the world's ambitions. The archives taught me otherwise. They showed a church that, for all its divine calling, was anchored in human reality. The documents are a mosaic of moments where faith met power head-on. A papal envoy's report from 1940 Spain details efforts to temper Franco's regime, urging mercy for political prisoners while maintaining diplomatic ties. Another file, from the 1980s Philippines, describes the Vatican's quiet support for the People Power Revolution, balancing encouragement with caution to avoid alienating allies. These stories, preserved in the archive's silent halls, are not of a monolithic institution, but of countless individuals, popes, priests, diplomats, navigating a world where faith could be both a shield and a weapon. As I worked in those archives, the weight of these choices settled over me like dust. The Church's role in politics was not about domination, but endurance, preserving the light of faith in a world often bent on extinguishing it. Yet, the documents ask us to consider the cost. When does pragmatism become compromise? When does survival overshadow principle? The answers lie in the pages, in the careful script of those who wrestled with these questions long before us. The Vatican Secret Archives are a labyrinth of whispers, where the written word holds power to both illuminate and unsettle. As I moved through those shadowed halls, my fingers tracing the spines of ancient manuscripts, I felt the weight of ideas that had been deemed too dangerous to roam free. The archives are not just a haven for history's triumphs. They are a vault for its outcasts, texts that challenged, provoked, or simply asked too many questions. These are the forbidden texts, the apocryphal Gospels, the banned books of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, and the stories of censorship that ripple through literature, cinema, and philosophy. In the dim light of the archives, I uncovered pages that were silenced not out of malice, but from a fear that their words might shake the foundations of faith. As Father Elias, I learned that the Church's battle with ideas was not about suppressing truth, but about guarding a fragile balance between divine revelation and human curiosity. Imagine a 4th century scroll, its parchment brittle as autumn leaves, tucked away in a locked case. These are the apocryphal Gospels, Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, or the Infancy Gospel of James. I held one such manuscript. Its Coptic script faded but legible, recounting sayings of Jesus not found in the canonical Bible. The words were poetic and enigmatic, suggesting a mysticism that felt both sacred and strange. These texts, written by early Christian communities, were excluded from Scripture not because they were false, but because they didn't fit the unified narrative the early church sought to build. The archives preserve them, not as relics of heresy, but as echoes of a faith still finding its shape. Reading them, I pictured desert monasteries, scribes laboring by lamplight, their words a bridge to a Christ who felt closer, more human, yet dangerously unbound by doctrine. The Church's decision to set these texts aside was a choice to define orthodoxy, to draw a line between what would guide and what might confuse. Then there's the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Church's infamous list of banned books, which lingered until 1966. The archives hold the original decrees, their pages thick with the weight of authority, listing works deemed harmful to faith or morals. I turned the pages of one such index, its Latin text arc, naming authors like Galileo, Voltaire, and even Victor Hugo. The reasons varied: heresy, immorality, or ideas that challenged the Church's authority. One entry caught my eye: a 17th century philosophical treatise, its author a forgotten scholar who questioned the nature of divine justice. The document banning was precise, citing risks to the faithful souls. As I read, I imagined the scholar's despair, his work silenced, his voice confined to these archives. The index wasn't just a list. It was a fortress, built to protect a flock from ideas the Church feared might lead them astray. Censorship extended beyond books. The archives contained records of battles over literature, cinema, and philosophy. A file from the 1950s detailed the Church's objections to a French novel, its pages deemed too sensual for Catholic readers. Another, from the 1980s, chronicled debates over a film portraying Jesus in a way that sparked outrage. I held a letter from a bishop, his handwriting sharp with frustration, arguing that such works distorted the gospel's truth. The Church's response wasn't always suppression. Sometimes it was a call for revision, a plea to align art with faith. Yet, these efforts often left scars: writers censored, filmmakers ostracized, philosophers branded as threats. The archives don't hide these stories. They preserve them, showing a Church wrestling with a world where ideas move faster than doctrine could contain. The act of censorship was not about erasing truth, but about control. Control over what the faithful encountered, what might shape their hearts. A 19th century document, its edges worn, described the Vatican's ban on a scientific journal advocating Darwin's theories. The accompanying letter, from a cardinal, expressed fear that such ideas could erode belief in creation. Reading it, I felt the tension of a Church caught between its sacred mission and a world exploding with new knowledge. The archives hold countless such moments: letters from authors pleading their case, reports from priests tasked with enforcing bans, even apologies from later popes who lifted restrictions. These papers are a dialogue, not a monologue, revealing a Church that both resisted and adapted to the tide of human thought. As I worked in the archives, I began to see these forbidden texts as more than relics of conflict. They were voices, some defiant, some devout, all seeking to understand the divine. A manuscript from a 12th century mystic, suppressed for its unorthodox visions, spoke of God in terms that felt alive, almost tactile. I imagined her, a woman cloistered in a cold stone cell, her words flowing like a river, only to be damned by fear of their power. The archives kept her voice, not to bury it, but to preserve it, perhaps waiting for a time when it could be heard without fear. These texts, these bans, were not about denying truth, but about timing, when to speak, when to wait, when to trust the faithful to grapple with ideas. The silences imposed by censorship are not empty. They are filled with intention, with the Church's desire to shepherd its flock through a world of competing voices. Yet, they also reflect a struggle to balance openness with authority, inquiry with faith. I recall a file on a 20th century philosopher, his works banned for questioning papal infallibility. His letters, preserved in the archives, were not angry but pleading, asking for dialogue. The Church's response: formal and unyielding, left no room for debate. As I read, I wondered what might have been if those voices had been heard, if the Church had leaned into questions rather than away from them. The Vatican Secret Archives are a testament to this tension. They hold the forbidden, the banned, the silenced, not to erase them, but to remember them. Each text is a story of faith tested, of ideas that push too far, too fast. As I stood among those shelves, the weight of those choices pressed against me, a reminder that truth is not always welcomed with open arms, but endures, waiting for the right moment to speak. The Vatican Secret Archives are a sanctuary of stories, but not all are tales of triumph or quiet heroism. Some are shadows, moments when the Church's human frailty casts long, troubling echoes. As I walked those hushed corridors, my lantern casting flickers across ancient shelves, I uncovered documents that spoke of scandals, crises that shook the faithful, not from external foes, but from within the Church's own heart. Financial missteps of the Banco Ambrosiano, the leaked secrets of Vatileaks, and the slow, painful response to sexual abuse cases. Each file I held, its pages heavy with ink and consequence, was a reminder that even an institution founded on divine calling is carried by human hands, capable of error, ambition, and regret. As Father Elias, I saw the Church not as infallible, but as a vessel of faith navigating turbulent waters, sometimes faltering under the weight of its own choices. Picture a 1980s dossier, its cover stamped with the Vatican seal, detailing the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, a scandal that became known as the God's Banker affair. I opened it carefully, the paper crisp despite its age, revealing a web of financial intrigue. The bank, closely tied to the Vatican, fell in 1982 amid accusations of money laundering and fraud, leaving a $1.3 billion debt. The documents chronicled frantic letters between Vatican officials and the bank's chairman, Roberto Calvi, whose mysterious death, found hanging under a London bridge, sparked whispers of conspiracy. A memo, written in a cardinal's precise hand, expressed shock at the scale of mismanagement, while another outlined efforts to distance the Church from the fallout. Reading these, I imagined the Vatican's inner chambers, where trust in God's banker unraveled, revealing how faith and finance could entangle in dangerous ways. The archives didn't hide the scandal. They preserved its raw truth, a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked. Then there was Vatileaks, a storm that broke in 2012. Its ripples still felt in the archive's quiet stacks. I held a folder marked with simple code, its contents a collection of leaked documents, private letters, financial reports, memos from Pope Benedict XVI's desk. These papers, smuggled out by a trusted butler, expose internal power struggles, allegations of corruption and mismanagement within the Vatican's walls. One letter, written in a hurried script, detailed a cardinal's concerns about favoritism in Vatican contracts. Another, from a whistleblower, begged for reform, its tone desperate yet devout. The archives captured the Church's response. Investigations launched, apologies issued, and a pope's resignation. Benedict XVI's, a rare act in centuries. As I read, the silence of the archives felt alive with the weight of betrayal, not just of trust, but the Church's mission to be a light in the world. These documents weren't buried. They were preserved, a testament to a moment when the Church faced its own reflection. The most painful files, though, were those tied to the sexual abuse scandals. The archives hold reports, letters, and legal documents spanning decades, their words heavy with sorrow and accountability delayed. I recall a file from the early 2000s, its pages dense with accounts from victims, their voices filtered through bishops' reports. A letter from a priest, his handwriting shaky, confesses guilt and begged for guidance, while another, from a diocesan official, urged silence to protect the Church's reputation. The Vatican's response, documented in later files, was slow, too slow for many. Reports from the 1990s show early warnings ignored, cases reassigned rather than confronted. By the 2010s, under Pope Francis, the archives reveal a shift. Investigations ordered, policies reformed, apologies made public. Yet, the earlier silences, preserved in those pages, spoke of a Church struggling to reconcile its pastoral role with its institutional instincts. Reading them, I felt a knot in my chest, not as a priest, but as a man who knew the cost of trust broken. These scandals, financial, political, moral, are not the Church's whole story, but they are part of it. The archives don't sanitize them. They lay them bare, showing a church wrestling with its own humanity. A 1980s memo on Banco Ambrosiano described frantic meetings to salvage the Vatican's credibility. The air thick with tension as cardinals debated damage control. A Vatileaks document, a private note from a Vatican secretary, expressed anguish at the Church's tarnished image, urging prayer alongside action. The abuse files, perhaps the heaviest, include letters from victims' families, their words raw with pain, pleading for justice. These documents are not just records. They are cries, confessions, and calls for redemption, preserved for those who dare to listen. As I worked in the archives, I saw these scandals as wounds, not fatal but deep. The Banco Ambrosiano affair revealed the dangers of worldly ambition creeping into sacred spaces. Vatileaks exposed the fragility of trust within the Vatican's walls. The abuse scandals, most of all, showed the cost of protecting an institution over its people. Yet, the archives also hold signs of healing, reforms, apologies, steps toward transparency. A 2018 file, its ink still fresh, detailed Pope Francis's meetings with survivors, his commitment to change scrawled in notes that felt like a promise. These pages don't erase the past, but they show a church capable of learning, however slowly. The archives are a mirror, reflecting the Church's triumphs and its failures. These scandals, preserved in ink and paper, are not accusations but lessons, reminders that even the holiest institutions are carried by human hands. As I turned those pages, I felt the weight of those choices, the struggle to balance faith with accountability. The Church's scandals are not its end, but part of its journey, a journey toward truth, however painful it may be. The Vatican Secret Archives hold stories that shimmer like hidden gems, tucked away in the folds of history. As I wandered those silent shelves, my footsteps soft against the stone floor, I discovered voices that had long been overshadowed, yet refused to fade. Among them were the voices of women, nuns, mystics, and unsung faithful, who left their mark on the Church, their words preserved in manuscripts that hum with resilience and devotion. The archives are not just a record of popes and councils. They are a testament to women like Hildegard of Bingen, to liturgical texts penned by nuns, and to the modern debates over female deacons that echo through time. As Father Elias, I came to see these documents not as relics, but as living threads, weaving women's contributions into the Church's tapestry, often against the grain of a world that sought to silence them. Picture a 12th century manuscript, its vellum pages illuminated with vibrant greens and golds, the work of Hildegard of Bingen, a German mystic whose visions lit up the medieval world. I held one of her letters, its Latin script flowing like a river, describing divine revelations that came to her in flashes of light. Hildegard wasn't just a nun. She was a composer, a healer, a preacher who advised popes and emperors. Her writings, preserved in the archives, speak of a God who spoke through her, a woman deemed worthy to carry divine truth. Yet her visions, bold and unorthodox, were scrutinized, her authority questioned by a church uneasy with a woman's voice so powerful. Reading her words, I imagine her in her Rhineland convent, her quill scratching late into the night, undeterred by those who doubted her. The archives keep her legacy alive, not as a footnote, but as a beacon of faith that burned bright despite the constraints of her time. Beyond Hildegard, the archives hold treasures crafted by other women, liturgical texts written by nuns, their voices woven into the Church's worship. I found a 9th century psalter, its margins adorned with delicate prayers composed by an anonymous sister. The script was meticulous, each word a devotion, offering solace to a community bound by faith. Another document, a 14th century hymnal, bore the name of a Benedictine nun, who crafted songs of Mass, her melodies meant to lift souls to God. These texts, often ensigned, were acts of love, preserved in the archives as proof that women shaped the Church's spiritual life, even when their names were forgotten. Holding them, I felt the quiet strength of these women, their prayers rising like incense from cloister walls, their contributions enduring in the silence of the ages. The archives also reveal women's roles in moments of crisis. A 16th century letter, its ink faded but legible, came from a Spanish abbess who sheltered refugees during a time of war. Her words, addressed to a bishop, pleaded for resources to feed the hungry, her convent a sanctuary amid chaos. Another file, from the 19th century, detailed a group of Italian nuns who ran hospitals during a cholera outbreak, their bravery noted in a brief Vatican report. These women, often overlooked in grand histories, were the Church's hands and heart, their stories tucked away in the archives like seeds waiting for light. As I read, I pictured their faces, whether by service, their faith a quiet defiance against a world that undervalued them. Yet, the archives also hold the tension of women's place in the Church. A 20th century dossier, its pages typed rather than handwritten, Chronicle debates over female deacons, a question that stirred both hope and resistance. I found reports from theologians, their arguments dense with scripture, weighing whether women could serve in roles closer to the altar. One document, from a 1970 synod, recorded a bishop's plea for women's inclusion, his voice drowned out by tradition's weight. Another, from the 2010s, showed Pope Francis's call for study, his words cautious but open. These papers, still warm with the ink of recent decades, reflect a church grappling with change, its roots deep in a past where women's roles were confined. Reading them, I felt the push and pull of progress, the slow unfolding of a faith that seeks to honor all its members. The archives don't shy away from the struggles. A 13th century record described a nun whose mystical writings were suppressed, her visions deemed too bold for public sharing. The document, a cold directive from a bishop, ordered her silence, yet the archive preserved her words, a quiet rebellion against erasure. Another file, from the Renaissance, detailed a convent's fight to keep its autonomy, its abbess arguing against a male overseer. Her letters, sharp and eloquent, were a testament to women who push against the boundaries of their time. These stories, buried among thousands of pages, are not of defeat but of endurance, showing women who carved space for their faith in a church that often limited their voice. As I worked in those halls, the weight of these documents settled over me. They were not just papers, but lives of women who prayed, wrote, served, and sometimes defied. The archives hold their contributions not to hide them, but to protect them, waiting for a world ready to hear. Hildegard's visions, the nuns' hymns, the debates over deacons. They are threads in a larger story, one where women's faith shaped the church, even when the world looked away. I imagine those women, their hands steady as they wrote, their hearts full of God who saw them, even when others did not. The Vatican Secret Archives are a chorus of voices, and women's voices sing within it. Clear and unbroken, these documents, from medieval manuscripts to modern reports, show a church carried not just by popes and priests, but by women whose faith was their strength. Their stories challenge us to see the church not as a monolith, but as a community shaped by all who call it home. The Vatican Secret Archives are a realm where the sacred meets the secret, where the rituals that shape the church's heart are recorded with reverence and care. As I moved through those shadowed halls, the air thick with the scent of ancient parchment, I felt the pulse of ceremonies that have defined the church for centuries. These are not the stuff of wild conspiracies, but the quiet, deliberate acts of faith, papal conclave protocols, extraordinary canonization procedures, and symbols reserved for moments of crisis. Each document I held, its pages worn by time, was a window into the church's soul, revealing how it guards its most sacred moments. As Father Elias, I saw these rituals and symbols not as mysteries to unravel, but as anchors, tying the church to its divine mission to the chaos of history. Imagine a sealed chamber in the Vatican, its walls adorned with ancient tapestries, where cardinals gather to elect a pope. The archives hold the protocols of the papal conclave, detailed in documents that read like sacred choreography. I opened one such file, its Latin text precise, outlining the rules established centuries ago. The oath of secrecy, the burning of ballots to signal the vote's outcome, the white smoke that announces a new pontiff to the world. A 15th century manuscript described a conclave's tension, its scribe noting the whispered prayers as cardinals cast their votes by candlelight. Another, from 2005, detailed the election of Pope Benedict XVI, its pages marked with the meticulous steps of a ritual unchanged by time. Reading these, I pictured the Sistine Chapel, its frescoes watching over men tasked with choosing God's vicar on earth. The conclave is not just a vote, It's a sacred act. Its secrecy is a shield to protect the Church from worldly pressures. The archives also preserve the protocols for extraordinary canonizations, the process by which the Church declares a soul a saint. I held a document from the 17th century. It's ink-faded but legible, describing the canonization of Teresa of Avila. The text outlined miracles investigated, testimonies gathered, and debates over her worthiness. Another file, from the 20th century, detailed the rushed canonization of a martyr during a time of persecution, the Church invoking rare procedures to honor a life cut short. These documents are not dry records. They pulse with the drama of faith tested, of lives deemed so holy they bridge heaven and earth. As I read, I imagined the Vatican's halls alive with discussion, theologians poring over evidence, their voices echoing with awe at God's work through human hands. The archives guard these protocols, not to hide them, but to ensure their sanctity, their power reserved for moments when the Church needs to proclaim hope. Then there are the symbols, subtle yet potent, reserved for times of crisis. The archives hold descriptions of these, objects, gestures, and signs that carry meaning known only to a few. A 13th century parchment, its edges crumbling, described a seal used during a schism. Its design a call for unity etched in wax. Another document, from the 1940s, detailed a coded symbol sent to bishops during World War II, signaling the Church's covert aid to those in need. I found a letter from a cardinal, its tone urgent, explaining a ritual gesture used in a time of plague, a cross trace in ash, meant to invoke divine protection. These symbols, preserved in the archives, are not mere relics. They are the Church's silent language, speaking when words alone fail. As I traced their descriptions, I felt their weight, a reminder that faith often finds voice in the unspoken, in the signs that endure beyond the moment. These rituals and symbols are the Church's heartbeat, preserved in the archives with a care that borders on reverence. A 19th century file described a conclave disrupted by political intrigue, its protocols enforced to protect the vote's purity. Another, from the 21st century, outlined a canonization process adapted for a globalized world, its steps debated to balance tradition with modernity. These documents show a Church that evolves yet holds fast to its roots, its rituals a bridge between past and present. As I worked in those halls, I saw the care with which these records were kept, each page a testament to the belief that sacred acts must be guarded, not from the faithful, but for them. The archives also reveal the human side of these rituals. A letter from a cardinal, written during a conclave, confesses fear of choosing wrongly, his faith tested by the weight of responsibility. Another, from a bishop overseeing a canonization, expressed awe at the miracles he investigated, his words trembling with wonder. These voices, preserved in the archives, remind us that rituals are not just ceremonies. They are moments where the divine touches a human, where the Church seeks to align itself with God's will. Reading them, I felt a connection to those who came before me, their hands steady as they enacted rituals that carried the Church through storms. The Vatican Secret Archives are a treasury of these sacred acts. Their page is a map of the Church's journey through time. They hold the protocols, the symbols, the moments when faith was formalized into ritual, binding the faithful to something greater. As I stood among those shelves, I saw not just a Church of power, but one of purpose, its rituals and symbols a way to navigate a world that often tests the soul. If Father Elias' story has moved you or made you think, please share it. It could be just what someone else needs to hear. Father Elias' life shows us that change is possible for everyone. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos, where we'll explore the stories of other biblical characters and the valuable lessons they teach us. Just as God transformed Father Elias' life, he also has a plan for you. See you in the next video.